Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching today. When I was asked to present a project, I thought, or rather present a talk, I thought, what should I talk about? And I thought, well, I could talk about history, but history is rather boring. And then I could talk about religion, but religion can get controversial. And then I could talk about politics, and boy, that could really get controversial. So what I'm going to talk about today instead is getting an idea started. I'm going to try to talk not about what to do or how to do it, but the thoughts and the processes that go into making an item that one wishes to construct. What I'm going to try to do is talk about the idea that needs to be developed, and then how to think about drawing plans, developing a cut list. And certainly you need to consider the type of wood, and then plan the sequence of cuts and assembly that you want to make. And then finally, I'm going to mention some finish options that, that I've been using lately, and summarize things that I've said. Most important thing I probably could say is this: measure twice or even 3 times, and then cut once. All right, are we on to the slides now? All projects, as one could imagine, begin with an idea. This can be something you need at home, or something that somebody requests, whether it be a client or a spouse or a family member, but nevertheless, the project begins with an idea. Once that is done, decision of what to make and how to make it emanates from the client, because after all, they're going to be the eventual user of our project. Tonight, rather than discussing something that's complicated, I'm going to limit my comments to the design, plan, and then the construction and the steps to follow in the construction of a table that would be suitable for a sofa or a bedside. As you can see, the slide on the left is a fairly simple shaker type table that happens to have a drawer in it. And go back one. And then the upper right hand corner is a fairly complicated 2-drawer tables that I made several years ago that has a lot of embellishment and burl inlay in it. And of course, if one wants to be rather daring and adventuresome, you can do a unconventional modern type of table, such as the one in the lower right hand corner. This is a closer up view of the side table, of which I made a pair of, that has burl inlay with stringing and bellflowers, and the oval corners that I made, quarter oval corners in each of the 4 corners. At the bottom, I have a black veneer topped by a cuff banding around each of the 4 legs. The first thing I can say, which is important as anything, is make some plans. You've got to have some sort of idea of what you're going to make, how you're going to make it, what it's going to look like. And the plans can be anything as simple as this quick drawing I made on the left side, literally on the back of an envelope. And it's got some quick measurements just to give an idea of what one wants to build and construct, with some measurements. If one wants to become a little bit more precise, you can get some lined paper, and of course you can use sketchbook if you have access to it, and make some more formal plans that can give you an idea of what you're trying to construct. Down below is a Winchester style serpentine type dresser. The plans were drawn by Steve Hamilton and Jeff Headley up in Winchester, Virginia. And it can give you a more professional idea of what you're trying to make. And of course, there are some DVDs available. I think they might be available on YouTube these days. But this is a Federal side table that has banding along the bottom edges that was produced by the fine woodworking people, with Steve Latta making the comments and instruction. Once you decide what you're going to build, then you need to make a cut list. After all, when you make the piece, you need to decide what wood and how much wood of whatever particular item you're trying to make. This is a drawing, not a drawing, but a listing of my side table for this project. And as you can see, there are the rough cut dimensions in the center column, and then the final dimensions on the right series of columns. In this case, there will be 3 pieces: a top, a leg, and the apron. And of course, if you decide to do stringing, have drawers or runners or guides or any other type veneer, you need to include this and make notes as you work on your cut list. In round numbers, the most important number is how many board feet do you need and how thick should the wood be. The top is going to be 3/4 to 13/16 of an inch. If you have access to a planer or a thickness sander, then certainly you don't have to be as precise, but nevertheless, you need to buy more than you think you need. In this case, the top is going to be about 3 board feet square, and the aprons are going to be about 2 board feet, and this would be then a total of about 5 board feet of 4/4, that is 3/4 of an inch lumber. The legs are going to be cut from wood that's either 6/4 or 1.5 inch, or 8/4, which would be a little bit less than 2 inches. And they will be cut from a single board. In this case, at 2 inches times 4 is 8 inches. So you would have a piece of 8/4 inch wood that would be about 30 to 36 inches long. I mentioned those numbers because, let me remind you, you can't just tell the lumber company how much wood you want and then they'll cut it off a piece of lumber. You may have to take whatever they'll sell to you, and it may be a little bit or sometimes a lot more than what you want. In addition, if you make mistakes, you want to have extra lumber, and you need to have about 10 to 15% extra lumber when you purchase your initial lumber supply, so that you can have not only leftover wood, but wood in case there are mistakes. Remember, you can't always have the wood cut exactly to the length you want, and you may encounter splits, knots, or other type of defects that you have to encounter as you make your piece. I have up there that one with that funny mark is supposed to be primary or secondary wood. If you're going to have drawers, you need some secondary wood such as poplar or pine in order to make runners and drawer bearings. Once you decide on the drawing, then we've got to decide on the size and dimensions. I put this later rather than sooner in my presentation because we have to have a cut list at some point, and I wanted to get us thinking about that. The size in this case is going to be 28 inches high. The top's going to be 8 inches square, and the wood is going to be the wood of your choice. That could be walnut, cherry, mahogany, and there are certainly many other types of wood available that you can choose from. One of the questions I'm asked is, where does one purchase the wood? And the answers are large lumber stores, such as one down in central Georgia called the Wood Yard, Sweetwater, CAG, which is in Gainesville, Georgia, and I think they are one of our sponsors. Did I mention Sewanee, Peach State, and of course the somewhat finished wood are available from the woodworking stores such as Rockler and Woodcraft. If you go to the big lumber companies, they often have the wood that is unplaned and in rough cut, and you can't quite see the grain and know what you're working with. This is an example of a table, and again, when I speak of measurements, I'm not talking pure numbers, I'm talking about 28 inches, because if the top, or if the wood happens to be 13/16, then we've already added a 16th to the number we chose. So about 28 inches is what we are working with. And then in this case, this is a piece of a cherry table that we saw earlier that's 18 by 18 inches square. For the legs, should we think about, are they going to be square or tapered or, gee whiz, turned? Well, sometimes you can turn legs depending on the style of furniture, and you might could turn the feet at the bottom, but we're not going to go in that direction tonight. We're going to consider square legs, and probably it'll have a taper later on. And this is a simple table, and therefore we will keep up with our square profile as opposed to having any other profile. A taper for the leg is important. It will help the table to be more elegant. It'll give it a somewhat lighter appearance because the feet are somewhat smaller, and it'll add more design style to the table. And I'll get back to how to cut a taper later on. For the aprons are going to provide both stability and completeness to the overall appearance for the table we're making. An option would be to have some sort of brace or stretcher down at the bottom of the feet, about 4 inches off the floor, but that would interfere with the cleanliness and I think the lightness of the table that we're trying to design. So while it's an option, I'm not going to discuss that any further. Well, how about the width of the apron? How wide should it be? Usually an apron is between about 2 to 5 inches. 2 inches is really a little bit too narrow. It just doesn't offer much support either. So after making the plans and rough drawings that I showed earlier, we're going to limit our apron to about 4 inches wide. And in this case, it happens to be about 4 3/4 inches wide, which will fit into the overall design of the piece. The slide on the right shows a small table that has a drawer in it, and if you see that middle number, it says 3 3/4. That should be 5 1/4 inches rather than 3 1/4. I didn't add right, but I'm working on my mathematics. Next. The legs need to be inset from the sides or the corners of the table, probably about 1 to 2 inches. In this case, I'm going to choose 1 1/2 inches to start. So that's 1 1/2 inches left, 1 1/2 inches right. So that's 2 times that number for a total of 3 inches of offset or inset. Since the tabletop is 18 inches square and the legs are going to be 1 1/4 inches, then we multiply 2 times 1 1/4 to get 2 1/2 inches. We consider the 3 inches of the inset from the 18-inch total square size of the table, so that the total number is 18 minus 3 equals 15 minus 2 1/2, and that equals 12 1/2 inches long for the apron. It's going to be 4 inches wide, but let me remind you again that if the apron has a drawer, it has to be wider to accommodate the rails. In this case, the table that I showed earlier is an 8-inch wide apron because it had 2 drawers in it. Also, there's stringing around the bottom, and part of your thought process has to be, when do you add the stringing? And you need to think about that as you are constructing and gluing your pieces of the table together, so that they can be coordinated, because it's really awkward to have to cut a small rabbet at the bottom of that apron once it gets assembled. In addition, if you look at the drawer side, the apron that is on this particular table, it is flush with the side of the leg as opposed to being inset. If you want to make it flush, that is certainly your option. But believe me, it takes a whole lot of precision to have that exactly flush and matching. Whereas if you have a small inset, then it will be a whole lot easier to construct. For the thickness of our apron, we're going to maintain the same piece of wood that we are going to use for the tops, and that's going to be about 3/4 of an inch thick. Thus, our aprons each are going to be 12 1/2 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3/4 of an inch thick. But let me remind you, if you want to use mortise and tenon joinery, then you need to remember to add about 1 1/2 inches length to the apron, which would be a 3 1/2 inch tenon. I'm sorry, 1 3/4 inch tenon on each end. So that would make the overall length 1 1/2 inches longer, for a total of a 4-inch long apron. I mentioned earlier that the aprons could be inset or flush. I would suggest about 1/8 of an inch inset, which would make it easier to place, be less sanding, and the inset also provides a shadow line or a more visible appearance to the table that we're making. For methods of attachment of the leg, there are several choices. Certainly the old-fashioned and traditional mortise and tenon is the classical way to attach the leg that I just mentioned in considering the length of the apron. However, a domino machine is made by Festool is certainly a viable option. Pocket screws would be another option. And I'm going to mention biscuits because it might be something some people have access to, but they're not very strong and not very reliable. But it certainly would be a last option. If you want to go back to the second method I mentioned, which is dominoes, you could use a router and cut a slot or a small dado and make your own floating tenons if you want to go in that direction. Now that we've designed the legs and the apron, we need to think about the taper for the leg. Well, as I said, it's going to make it certainly lighter in appearance and give more visual interest. So what we would do is, again, accept that the apron is 4 inches wide So what you would do would be to make a mark about 4.5 inches below the top of the leg. And then at the bottom of the leg, you would measure and mark about 5/8 to 7/8 inches from the outside corner. And you also need to make sure that you mark the inside and outside corners so that you don't cut the wrong sides. There would be two cuts. The two inside faces are going to be the ones cut. This picture shows that I made this, you can see that 16, that's a architect's triangle there, and that leg, that tapers down to about 5/16, I'm sorry, 5/8 of an inch. Remember, cut the mortises while the leg is square. It'll make it a whole lot easier. Cut the mortises before the leg is tapered. Once you get these two marks, 4.5 inches and about 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch, you mark a straight line between these two marks, and then you cut. There are several ways to cut it. You can cut that with a table saw and a jig, a band saw and a plane, or you can use a jointer, which gets kind of tricky, but certainly that's an option. Finally, we get to the top. The top is the showpiece of our piece of furniture. But before we get to the top, we need to think about how are we going to attach the top to the base. Because if you get the base all glued up and finished, then you may not have room to get in and have access to the interior to be able to make the attachment. Choices include buttons, which are sort of like wooden clamps, and they have a little tongue that goes inside a small dado that clamps the apron to the top of the table. There are some metal Z-clamps that are somewhat similar, but they're not quite as elegant. And the third choice would be to use screws that have slotted holes on the sides of the tabletop in order to allow for movement. Remember, once it's attached, the top is going to be the focal point of the table, and one must consider the grain, color, arrangement, alignment, and the glue joint, all that are going to contribute to the eventual beauty of the table. For instance, this is the slide I showed earlier of a cherry table, and you can sort of see, I think this is somewhat of a raking light, and it's not as visible in real life, but you can see where the board was glued up as 3 pieces. The next slide, we skipped one, skipped 2, go back, one more. Oh, we don't, one more. The slide shows the top of this table, and it showed that the joints for the tabletop were very, very invisible and difficult. This is a table I made. I don't know if you've heard of Sam Maloof, but this is a Maloof type of structural side table, and it has a central column rather than 4 legs. And if you go on eBay, that I did a couple of years ago, you can get that for the low price of about $12,000. But mine doesn't sell for nearly that much if anybody is interested. Next. Once we've made the top, we've made the legs, we've glued them up, we're ready to do the finish. And my usual finish is what I'm going to go over with right now. My first coat is oil, linseed oil, and I usually dilute it about 50-50 with mineral spirits, whether you want to dilute it 25, 75, 75, 50, or put a couple of coats on is your choice, but I found that with this particular regimen, I can get a pretty good start to my finish. After you let this finish dry for about 24 hours, as in fact, each layer needs to have 24 hours to dry, then I began coating, and what I've been using is Helmsman spar varnish. Another option would be Minwax. And I use 25% polyurethane, 75% mineral spirits, weight a day. Second coat is 50% poly and 50% mineral spirits. Third coat is 75% poly and 25% mineral spirits. And then if I find that I need to do so, my fourth coat is about 90% polyurethane with about 10% mineral spirits. My fifth coat, if one wants to call it that, I use steel wool 4-aught, and I think Libron is one of the brands that's available. And I get some wax of whatever kind, Johnson paste wax, for instance, and I rub the entire finish with this steel wool and wax. Another option is use 220 or 300, 320 or even higher sandpaper, but I wax and buff the finish. And in fact, I have, after allowing each coat to dry for 24 hours, I also very, very gently, very, very lightly will sand with 220, 320, 600 grit sandpaper just to remove the nibs and nicks and dust and the grain that has been raised. Certainly, if one wants to, shellac is a very, very nice finish. And it is, on the one hand, quick and easy to apply, but on the other hand, it can be a little bit finicky. And lacquer is another option. And if one has availability of spray equipment, then certainly that would be an option to use in finishing. At this point, we're finished with our table. We're finished applying the finish, and we have put the top on. And let me tell you, when you put the top on, make sure the screws don't go through the top. That sort of makes one take a deep breath when you can see the point of the screw through the top. So there you go. What I have done tonight is to try to describe a summary of the idea, draw plans and work on a cut list, plan the sequence of cuts, any additions such as stringing, banding, embellishment, escutcheons, veneer inlays. Think again about the sequence of cuts and how you want to manage those. And I've discussed some finish options. One more reminder, measure twice, cut once. Any other questions, any questions, comments, or additions?
Very good, thank you.
Andy, I have a question for you. You put on several coats of finish, started with a high mix of mineral spirits to poly and gradually added more poly.
I'm receiving a message in my earpiece here that the video of this presentation is going to be available in about 2 weeks on the website, the Guild website, and the PowerPoint presentation will be available also.
I have a question. It has to do with your finish. You start with a heavily diluted amount of poly, and then you move on slowly to less diluted. I'm just wondering what your thought process is for going through those different variations of the dilution.
The first coat I dilute significantly, as you noticed, simply because it makes the finish dry quicker. I'm using it as a filler coat or a seal coat for the very first coat. And rather than having a very thick 100% that is coat. I'm just choosing to use a more dilute finish for the first couple of layers, so it will go on more smoothly and wipe off. I didn't say that, but I wipe all of my finishes off. I don't let them sit. Each of those finishes has been wiped off.
Oh, so what do you use to apply the finish then? Do you use like a foam brush or a bristle or rags?
Your choice. In fact, I use an old discarded t-shirt.
Okay, so these are all basically your homemade wipe-on finishes, it sounds like. Thank you.
Wipe-on category, although I think wipe-on finishes by definition are just regular finishes that have been diluted, but I wouldn't want to be held liable for that statement. That by applying several coats of diluted finish, it requires more to build up, but then it also dries quicker.
Someone was asking about putting polyurethane over an oil finish, which their recollection is it usually doesn't work well, but you're putting a polyurethane over a boiled linseed oil finish. Obviously, you've never had an issue with that in your experience.
I've never had an issue, and my understanding is that many of the polyurethane type finishes have linseed oil type oils in them anyway. But no, I've never had a problem, period. An option would be to not use boiled linseed oil and go directly to the polyurethane finish, or for that matter, use shellac and then continue with shellac and or go to the polyurethane finish. Something that I have to think about personally is that not living in Atlanta, since I live out in a small town, I don't have access to these sophisticated finishes, and I have to use what I can get at Home Depot or Lowe's at 8 o'clock at night when they're trying to close, and I can go to Home Depot and get one of these finishes quickly and make it a whole lot quicker rather than having to drive to Atlanta for 2 hours in the traffic and then get some of these sophisticated finishes, and then I can't use it all, and it dries and hardens and becomes unuseful. Whereas I can go to Home Depot or Walmart and get these two polyurethane finishes 7 days a week, literally.
Andy, thank you a million for doing this for us. I know it was a lot of work, and I know most of your work was reducing the 350 slides down to the number you did tonight.
Well, you're right. I started out with about 117 slides, and I was told I had a limit of 11. So I'm thinking, now how in the hell do I get rid of 106 slides? So I finally wound up with, I think that was 55. So maybe it didn't.
It worked out great. And this is, as I said at the beginning, this was our first attempt at live streaming combined with Zoom. We had a couple of little glitches, but I appreciate everybody's patience with us as we went through this. Should improve as we go along. And John Champion, why don't you close us up?
That is it. Andy, thank you again for all of us. Our next meeting is October 14, and Art Sanders will be talking more in depth about toy making. And that's another project we'd like to see more of on a year-round basis. So Art will be touching on that topic and what we can do as a guild in that regard. Thank you all for joining and participating, and look forward to seeing you next month.